Okay, here we go. We move along here in the course. We are at module number 8, and I'm going to talk about congratulations, you're under contract, which is great news. So now the big hurdle that we got to get through is the inspection and then the appraisal. So I've got a few tips, a few pointers on how to work through the inspection with your buyers. So let me go here to share the screen. And that was good. Very easy today. The backstage crew is cooperating. Okay, cool. So I would imagine that most of you are going to be buyer's agents for your buyers. And you can be a transaction broker. And I'm not going to step on anybody's toes. If you want to be a transaction broker, that's fine. What I'm going to talk about here is going to be primarily if you are a buyer's agent. And a lot of this is going to be based on your office policy. So I think, probably 98% of all the deals that I've done when I help buyers, I'm a buyer's agent. The only time I was not is if I was kind of facilitating both ends of the transaction. But most of the time, buyer's agent. And here, this is directly out of my contract from the Colorado approved forms. And these is pretty small, but you could see it. And you probably have the same thing in your contracts for the buyer agency. And these are all our responsibilities to our buyers. And so you can look through that. You can pause. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you could see our level of service, our level of responsibility is pretty high. And a lot of it is going to come into play here when we're talking about inspections. So what I always like to say when you're helping your buyer in the inspection, who are you loyal to? Your buyer or the transaction? Since we are a buyer's agent, we represent our buyer, not the transaction. So you need to act that way. You need to make sure that you're representing your buyer and you're not protecting the transaction. So you're protecting the best interests of your client. And then I just have here, don't make decisions for them. And I've talked about this before. It's their decision, their process. We advise, we counsel, we give our opinion. They might ask us what we would do. We could share our thoughts then. Now, here are some of the pitfalls that you can run into in the inspection process. I already talked about it, but you try to protect the deal. You're not representing your customer, your buyer, and you're trying to keep the deal together. You have to shake that mindset and realize that you're representing your buyer and making sure that they get what they want and need during the inspection process. The other thing you run into, you give bad advice to your sellers. I've heard a lot of agents say to their buyers, don't make a big list because you might lose the contract. Let your buyer do what they want to do. If they want to make a big list, that's fine. And I'll talk a little bit more about negotiating, but let them initially make the big list and then you can review it. But don't ever tell them, don't make a big list, only come up with 5 items. Let them come up with their list, especially if there's issues in the house. The other thing that I hear or I see agents do, they try to gloss over some of the items and they'll say, oh, don't worry, it's going to be okay. Don't worry about that furnace. It's 30 years old, it checked out, but you don't need to worry about it. 6 months after they buy the house, the furnace, the furnace bombs out. And then what are they going to do? They're going to remember you. Oh, Mario, you said that the furnace was going to be okay. And here it is 6 months later. So I never, ever say, don't worry, it's going to be okay. I'm not an inspector. I'm not a professional. I'm not a furnace guy. I'm not a window person. I'm not a roofer, all those kind of things. So don't ever try to gloss things over. If they ask you, is this a serious issue, then you have to be honest with them and you have to go based on the expertise of the home inspector or the appropriate contractor, the roofer, the electrician, the plumber, the sewer line, whatever it is. So make sure you don't fall into these pitfalls. Now for the actual inspection, what I like to do is to provide at least 2 or 3 home inspection companies. And depending on the property, you might know a home inspector which is a better fit than the others. So you can let your buyer know that. It's up to your buyer to schedule the home inspection. I talked before about if it's very competitive in multi-offers, and one of the strategies is to get the home inspection scheduled sooner. Maybe in those instances, you could step in, you can maybe connect the inspector with your buyer initially and touch base with the inspector and say, hey, what does your schedule look like next week? If today's like Thursday, you're going to write the offer on a Friday, ask them what their availability is for next week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but it's up to your buyer to schedule the inspection. It's not your responsibility. And then the buyer has to make the decision on what environmental tests they want to do. I always recommend them. In my area, we have radon gas, so we want to do a radon test. Other parts of the country, you might have termites, whatever it is, based on your area, you're going to know what the environmental issues are. And if there's a test to go along with it, make sure that your buyer does that. Now, this is something that could be based on your office policy. I know some offices, some real estate companies, broker offices, they will tell their agents not to show up at the inspections because they are not home inspectors. What I do is I do not attend the entire inspection. Most of the time what happens, they schedule it in the morning or the afternoon. Usually starts like at 8 or 9 o'clock. It'll wrap up at noon, or they'll start around 1. It'll wrap up around 4:30, 5 o'clock, whatever it is. What I will do, I will make an appearance at the end of the inspection when the inspector is giving a review, and then that way I can get the one-page sheet of the kind of the major items, and then I could be there. And if there's something that I need to see, I'll take a look at it. But again, I'm not a home inspector. I'm not going to give an opinion as to whether or not something is going to be okay. If I see something that's an issue, then I'll say, hey, well, that's something that we definitely need to address with the seller in the inspection objection. But that has been, again, my kind of the way I do it. Look for direction from your managing broker and your office policy. The inspectors are really good nowadays. They'll give you an email of the entire inspection report in a PDF with pictures and a lot of details. And they do a really good job. They have all got software now where they can create it, and the inspection is, done the same evening as the day of the inspection. Now, the inspection objection, you want to explain the process to your buyer. And I go through this multiple times, and I say, well, this is how it works. You have a right to do a home inspection. As a result of the home inspection, you've got a couple options. If there are so many items that come up in the home inspection where you do not feel comfortable with the house, could be a water issue, could be a roof issue, could be a foundation issue, whatever it is, in your subjective discretion, you can terminate the contract. No questions asked. You don't have to supply any reasons. We don't have to supply a copy of the inspection report. Just terminate. And then you can get your earnest money back per the contract. And that's what I say. Now, if there's items in the contract, in the inspection that you want to get fixed or get a credit, then we do an inspection objection. We submit it to the sellers, And then the sellers, what they can do is they can either agree to all the items, they can agree to a partial list of the items, and then we negotiate that partial list. And then lastly, they can reject it all and just say, we're not going to do anything. Now, if they reject it all, they're not going to do anything. If you still want to buy the property, you can do a withdrawal of notice, and basically we pull it back. We pull back the list, and then we can still remain in contract. So you as a buyer, you control this process. There's never any point in time where the seller can terminate the contract. It's always going to be up to you. And that's kind of how I explain it. So you could see how I go through it, and feel free to copy what I say. You know, salespeople, we're good copycats. We hear something, we want to use it. So no big deal. And so that's how I explain the process. Now, after the inspection, I tell my buyers that they need to put together a list of the items that they want to get credit or get credit, to get a repair or a credit, okay? Now, if they're going to get a credit, this is where your expertise as well as the home inspector can come in to determine what the credit amount is going to be. And if it's something that you don't know, then you can coordinate a service person, a contractor to come in, evaluate the situation, and give a bid. For example, a roofing issue, could be a water damage issue, could be windows, you know, sealed, the seals breach and you've got condensation in between the windows. Maybe you go through it and the carpets have a lot of stains. Maybe they have some damage. So you could get a quote either for, you know, steam cleaning or carpet replacement. But that is something that you can assist your buyer in getting those quotes. Now, once they put together the list, have them prioritize it. If they've got 10 items, they've got 15 items, let them know. The seller might agree to all of the items. They might reject them, or they might agree to a partial list. I'm being repetitive, but I think you have to do that with your buyers so they clearly understand what the issue is going to be. Again, we're thinking ahead. Now, you have 12 items. Identify what are the most important to them. And then one strategy that I always do, most agents do, you could provide a copy of the inspection report to the sellers when you submit the inspection objection form. And again, when you're submitting the inspection objection, you explain the process of to your buyer. Now, what I try to do when I'm creating that form, what I try to do is I will see if we can go here. Okay, we can see my face here again. So what I do when I submit that form, one of my strategies is that, you know, I use the text that the buyer gives me for the inspection items, and then I also reference the inspection report, and sometimes I'll just use the same language that the inspector has in the report. I'm going to talk about this here again, but do not reference anything in the inspection report in the inspection resolution. You can do that in the objection, but not the resolution, because the resolution is going to be something that goes to the lender. If they see that you're referencing page 47, item number 3 in the inspection report, they're going to say, we need a copy of the inspection report. We don't want that. We don't want the lender to get a copy of the full inspection report. And the lender doesn't want that either. We don't want underwriting going through all that stuff. Okay, let's go back to the share screen. Hey, what happened? I lost my, no, let's see. Go back here, share screen. There we go. Okay, cool. Sorry about that. Okay, now, once we submit the inspection objection form, then we're going to wait for the seller's response, which is going to be either in an email, and then we need to agree on an inspection resolution document. And again, just going through it, this is what the seller can do. And when you're doing the credits on the inspection objection, you're going to get a credit back from the seller. Make sure you're talking to the lender that they're going to approve that. And again, you don't want it to be a high amount. So if you got a deal for 250,000 and you're going to give a seller credit at 10,000, that might not be fly with the lender. So make sure that you verify that. Now, throughout the process, just kind of keep the buyer informed. Now, when you're negotiating for the inspection, be prepared, think ahead. You could have a hardline seller, you could have an agreeable seller, you can have a walkover seller. It's a game of chicken. So what happens is, I'll give you an example. Let's say the inspection objection is, let's say, January 15th, and it's on a Friday. You want to have the inspection resolution no more than 2 or 3 days after the inspection objection. So if I did that on a Friday, I would have the inspection resolution deadline be on that Monday, which would be January 18th. Now, what happens is January 18th is the inspection resolution deadline, and a lot of times this goes right down to the wire, midnight, if you haven't specified an earlier deadline time. So be prepared. The seller might not agree to anything. They might have a backup offer and they're not going to give you a reply. So 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, you haven't heard back from them. So this is where you got to coach your buyer and say, if they don't get back to us, if we don't get a response, and if you still want to buy the house, we need to do a withdrawal of notice. And that's just a one-sided document. The buyer signs it. We submit it to the seller. And then once they get it, we're still under contract. Okay? Now, once the inspection resolution is signed, you need to give a copy to the lender. And like I said, don't reference the inspection report in the form. If giving credits, get approval from the lender. You always get guidance from the lender on the credits and any items in the inspection form. And then once it's done, you move forward. Now, some of the negotiating tips here are, depending on the situation, if it's a buyer's market, stay strong. If it's a seller's market and you've overbid by 10, 20,000, be strong. This is all a negotiating, right? You got to go from a position of strength. And sometimes the listing agent's going to give you guidance. Sometimes they're not. I remember a few years ago, I had a deal, and this was before my market got really hot, and the deal was like in the mid 600s, and my buyers put in an offer probably about 10K below. Sellers accepted it and did it after like 3 days. And then I noticed the listing agent was kind of getting hostile with me during the whole process. So my buyers, they were kind of technical. One of them was an engineer, very detail oriented. They put together this huge list, 22, 23 items. And again, I'm representing the buyer. I let them know what could happen. They could reject it, partial list, or agree to all of it. So we worked really hard. I'm helping my buyers. And I remember it was like a Sunday evening, and I went over to their apartment complex and in their community room going through all this. And so I think I submitted it the next day on a Monday. And within 10 minutes, I got an email back, a fax back, scan, whatever, and said, rejected. And then they gave a termination of the contract. And I'm like, you can't terminate the contract. I mean, my buyer controls that. And so this guy was being really hostile and, said all these things in there, buyers, blah, 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 and trying to get me to bite and trying to get me into a fight and all this kind of stuff. But, I just let it go. And, it was kind of funny because, here I am and I'm helping my buyers, and the listing agent's trying to pick a fight with me. So I would get angry. So I would terminate the contract, or advise my buyers, they're jerks and blah, blah, blah. So this is where I talked about before. You're calm. You don't react emotionally. So I took that cancellation, whatever they were not agreeing to anything. I didn't show my buyers the terminate stuff because it didn't matter. I didn't want to get my buyers agitated. So all I told my buyers is that the sellers were not going to do anything. And I said, based on the behavior of the listing agent, I'm 100% positive that they have a backup offer, and the backup offer is higher than our contract price. So what happened is the seller agreed to our offer a couple days after, 10K below list, and then they got another offer at list or above list. So they were purposely trying to agitate me and my buyers to terminate the contract. So again, I removed the emotion. I didn't get into that. And I just told my buyers what they needed to know. They rejected everything. More than likely, they have a backup offer higher than yours. You can still buy the property if you want to. All you need to do is a withdrawal of notice. You take back all those items, we remain in contract, and then we head to the appraisal and the closing. Pretty simple, right? So I told my buyers that, and they talked it over. It was a big thing for them, but in the end, they decided to move forward. Now notice I never said, you need to do this, you need to do that, I advise you to do this. I said, it's your decision. And never once did I, say, hey, you need to do this. I've been working with these guys a long time. This was the third or fourth contract we had been on. And, in the back of my mind, I'm kind of praying that they're going to agree to it. But I never once wanted to influence them because I didn't want it to be 6 months, a year, 2 years later. Mario, you said this, you said this, you said it was going to be okay. I never said in any of the items it was going to be okay. Don't worry about it. It wasn't my responsibility because I was not the home inspector. So they agreed, did a withdrawal notice. We stayed under contract. We got through the appraisal, and everything was hunky-dory. So really, really good. So that's something that I want you to be aware of when you're negotiating these inspections. Okay, appraisals. Appraisals are pretty straightforward. Prepare your buyer. The big thing is if the appraised value comes in less than the contract price, then that has to be resolved. Either the buyer has to bring additional money to the closing in the form of cash. So an example, let's say you have a contract price of $180,000, and what happens is the appraisal comes in at $175. Now, depending on the market, depending on the situation, the seller could say, I'm not going to reduce the price to $175,000. If the buyer wants to buy the property, they need to bring the additional $5,000 to the closing if they still want to buy the property, because what will happen is the lender will set up the loan at the $175,000 amount. Okay? Now, if the buyer doesn't want to bring the $5,000, then you can fall out of contract. But it's a negotiation. Make sure you take it down to the final, the final minute, because maybe the seller will cave at the end and say, okay, I'll do it at the 175. It's a negotiation, and do what your buyers want. Now, here is another situation, and I talk about it. Builders are inflexible. So I was helping a buyer about a year ago. In my market, like I said, it's pretty hot. Everything's been going up, multi-offers, and the builders have been setting their prices ahead of the market. So what that means is when they get to the appraisal, they don't have enough supporting data to justify that price. So use some easy numbers. Let's say the contract price is $550. The appraisal came in at $525. What the builders do now, and you have to look at their contract, because I remember I went through this with my buyers when we were going through the contract. I said, hey, let's make sure we look at the appraisal provision to make sure you're protected. I go into it right away. It states the builder tells the buyer if there is a difference between the appraised amount in the purchase price, it's the responsibility of the buyer to make up the difference. The builder is not going to do anything. If the buyer still wants to buy the property, they have to bring the additional funds to closing. So I went through this with my buyers, went through, saw that, okay, they were prepared, but I prepped them. And I told them in this price range, it could be that the builder is ahead of the market 10, 20, 30, 40K. And what happened was the difference ended up being 20,000. My buyers did have the ability, they did have the additional cash, and me prepping them helped them. And this is what the builder does too, because it's a longer process with the builder when you place an order, when you're doing a dirt start. It could take 8 months to 12 months to get to the closing. The appraisal usually doesn't happen until about 3/4 of the way through. And the buyer, I mean, they've invested so much time and emotion, and they're not going to bail on it. But if you have a buyer that doesn't have that additional funds, they don't have that flexibility, you need to be prepared. Some buyers you're helping, and they're buying a house for 220, and that's all the money they have to put down 20%, and they don't have the additional, let's say, $5,000, $10,000. And you're not going to pay for it because you're not in that business, to support your buyers. Okay, so be prepared with builders. And this is one of the pitfalls when you're dealing with builders, is that they use their own contracts. They don't use the approved forms that we use from the Real Estate Commission. Okay, let's go back to sharing a screen. Okay, so good information there. Appraisals in the hot market, make sure the listing agent does their job, because what happens is the appraiser is going to contact the listing office, the listing agent, to get access to the property. So this is an opportunity for the listing agent to make sure that the appraiser has the information that they need. You can give them a list of updates, remodeling costs, help the appraiser, ask them if they have enough supporting data, if you're a listing agent. But make sure the listing agent is doing that. And then you don't want the listing agent to be a Budinsky and, irritate the appraiser either. So this goes back to hoping that you have a good listing agent on the other side. Now, if it does come in lower and it is resale, don't panic. 80 to 90% of the time, the seller is going to agree to drop their price. I had one last summer where we were $5,000 difference and just did a split, and it was negotiated that way. The price came down 2,500. My buyers kicked in an additional 2,500. Whatever it is, okay? But don't panic. Okay, well, that's it. Those are some good tips on how to get through the inspection process, to get through the appraisal. If you have questions, you're dealing with this, you need help, go to your managing broker. Your lender can be a resource on any of the inspection credits. Your lender could be a resource on the appraisal. Sometimes on the appraisal, what could happen is that if the appraisal comes in so low and you don't think it's right, you can get a second opinion. And I did this a couple summers ago where the appraisal was off like 20,000, and it was crazy. And I'm going through the supporting the comps and everything, and it's like, this doesn't make any sense at all. So we went back to the lender, showed them all the information. The lender asked for a second appraisal, a second opinion, and then we were able to get it addressed. And I think when it came back, I think there was like $1,000 difference or something, which is easily correctable. But if you're dealing in a property that's selling in the 250 to 300 range, and the appraisal difference is like 220,000, I mean, that's really a lot of money. So that is also another option, and you can get assistance from your lender who's involved in the transaction. Now, if you're doing a cash deal, you don't do an appraisal. If you're helping a buyer, and you usually waive the appraisal provision, and it's not an issue. If you're any of the buyers that you're helping, I talked about this before, never ever waive the inspection provision. Now, maybe what you can do is, if it's a really hot market and you could tell the listing agent that the buyer is going to do an inspection, but they're not going to submit any items. And this is something you have to agree on with your buyer up front. But they just want to make sure that everything's okay, there's no issues, nothing catastrophic with the house, and they still have the right to terminate the contract and get their earnest money back. Okay. The best person you could talk to is your managing broker. If you need any assistance, you need any help, go to your managing broker. And like I've said before, I've been in a realtor since 2002, many, many years. I still go to my managing broker for advice, for counsel, for help, because sometimes I see things that are so weird and I'm like, what the heck do I do? And my managing broker, more often than not, has run into it with other agents in the office. Okay, well, that's it for this module. And now we're going to move on to the walkthrough and the closing. Okay.